My name is Alexandros Stavros Dimitriou, and until 3 years ago, I believed I was untouchable. I lived like a modern Greek god among mortals, floating through life on waves of inherited wealth that seemed as endless as the Aegean Sea itself. The Dimitriou shipping empire had been my family's legacy for 3 generations, and I wore that legacy like golden armor, protecting me from any real connection to the world beyond my marble palaces and platinum credit cards. Have you ever felt completely lost even when you have everything? That was my life for 28. Every morning, I woke up in my penthouse overlooking Mykonos harbor, where my collection of yachts bobbed like expensive toys in crystal clear water. The smell of sea salt, mixed with imported French coffee, would drift through floor-to-ceiling windows as my housekeeper, a quiet woman whose name I'm ashamed to admit I never bothered to learn, prepared my breakfast on china that cost more than most people's cars. My days blurred together in a haze of luxury that now feels nauseating to remember. Private jets to London for lunch, helicopter rides to remote beaches where I'd party with people whose names I collected like trophies but whose souls I never touched. Women threw themselves at me not for who I was, but for the zeros in my bank account and the power that came with the Dimitriou name. I fed on their worship like it was oxygen, each admiring glance inflating an ego that had grown monstrous over the years. The night everything changed started like any other. My best friend, Demetrius Roussos, had organized another one of his legendary parties in an abandoned warehouse in Athens. Demetrius came from old shipping money too, and together we were like 2 spoiled princes ruling over a kingdom of excess. The bass pounded through my chest as I moved through crowds of beautiful people who parted like the Red Sea when they saw me approaching. Crystal champagne flutes caught the strobe lights, while the air hung thick with expensive perfumes and the kind of reckless energy that only comes from having too much money and too little purpose. I remember laughing at something Demetrius said about buying an island just to name it after his latest girlfriend. The music was so loud I could feel it in my bones, and the combination of Dom Perignon and pure adrenaline made everything feel electric. Girls in designer dresses that cost more than teachers' salaries pressed close to me, their perfectly manicured hands trailing across my custom-tailored shirt as they whispered things they thought I wanted to hear. But around midnight, something shifted. Maybe it was the way one girl's laugh sounded hollow, or how another's smile never reached her eyes. For the first time in years, I felt suffocated by it all. The warehouse suddenly seemed too small, too hot, too fake. I needed air, space, something real. So I did what I always did when uncomfortable feelings threatened to surface. I ran. My Lamborghini Huracan sat in the VIP parking area like a golden beast waiting to devour the night. The engine roared to life with a sound that usually filled me with pride, but that night it sounded almost angry. I peeled out of the warehouse district with no destination in mind, just needing to move, to feel something other than the emptiness that was slowly eating me alive from the inside. That's when I made the mistake that would change everything. In my rush to escape, I took a wrong turn somewhere near Ammonia Square, then another. The gleaming office buildings and upscale shops of central Athens gradually gave way to narrower streets, crumbling apartment blocks, and the unmistakable smell of poverty that I'd spent my entire life avoiding. My golden Lamborghini looked obscene against the backdrop of peeling paint and broken streetlights. The contrast was so stark it was almost comedic. Here I was, a man who spent more on a single bottle of wine than these people probably saw in a month, completely lost in a world I'd pretended didn't exist just 20 minutes from my usual playground. Stopped at what looked like a dead end, cursing under my breath as I tried to figure out how to get back to civilization. The street was barely wide enough for my car, and garbage bags lined the walls like urban tumbleweeds. The smell hit me. Then, a mixture of rotting food, stagnant water, and human desperation that made my stomach turn. I'd never experienced anything like it. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, sitting on a piece of cardboard between two overflowing dumpsters, was a girl who couldn't have been older than 13. She was feeding a baby with a broken plastic spoon, her movements gentle despite the rough surroundings. Her clothes were clean but clearly second-hand, patched in places with fabric that didn't quite match. Her feet were bare, dusty from the concrete, but somehow she maintained a dignity that put my designer shoes to shame. But it was her eyes that stopped my world from spinning. When she looked up at the sound of my engine, our gazes locked across the impossible distance between our two worlds. Her eyes were the most stunning shade of blue I'd ever seen, like the deepest parts of the Mediterranean where sunlight struggles to reach. But it wasn't their color that froze me in place. It was what I saw in them. Pain, yes, but also a strength. That seemed impossible for someone so young. Wisdom that spoke of experiences no child should ever have. And something else. Something that reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until I couldn't breathe. Those eyes held no judgment. No plea for help. No recognition of my wealth or status. They simply saw me. The real me, stripped of all pretense and armor. For the first time in my life, someone was looking at Alexandros the person, not Alexandros the fortune, and what she saw there. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I sat in my idling car for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, unable to move, unable to look away. The baby in her arms made soft sounds, and she returned her attention to feeding him with such tenderness that it made my throat tight. She sang something under her breath, a lullaby that drifted through my open window despite the engine noise. Her voice was clear and sweet, cutting through the urban decay like a prayer. Have you ever had a moment where your entire life suddenly felt like a lie? Where everything you thought you knew about yourself crumbled in an instant? That was me, sitting in my $250,000 car, watching a homeless girl love a baby with more genuine emotion than I'd felt in years. Finally, she looked up again, and this time she tilted her head slightly, studying me with those impossible eyes. I wanted to drive away, to pretend this moment had never happened, to return to my safe world of meaningless luxury. But something in her gaze held me captive. It was like looking into the face of truth itself, and truth, I was learning, was terrifying. I turned off the engine and got out of the car, my Italian leather shoes crunching on broken glass and debris. Each step toward her felt like walking through water, the air thick with tension and the weight of a moment that would define the rest of my life. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just continued to hold my gaze with that steady, unblinking stare. When I was close enough to hear her breathing, I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. What do you say to someone whose eyes have just shown you everything wrong with your existence? How do you bridge a gap that wide with mere words? The baby chose that moment to start crying, and she immediately turned her attention to soothing him, rocking gently and making soft shushing sounds. It was then I noticed how thin she was, how the baby's cries seemed weaker than they should be, how both of them looked like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. If you're watching this and wondering why I didn't just drive away, why I didn't return to my comfortable life and forget what I'd seen. Let me ask you this. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and seen your own soul reflected back, broken and wanting? Because that's what happened to me that night. Those eyes, blue as ancient Greek seas and deep as forgotten myths, they didn't just see me. They changed me. But I still didn't know that this girl, this guardian angel feeding a baby in the shadow of dumpsters, held secrets that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family, my fortune, and the very foundation of my golden existence. I still didn't know that those eyes that froze me in place were about to lead me into a darkness so deep, I'd question whether gods like me were ever meant to see the light again. Standing there in that alley, surrounded by the smell of decay and broken dreams, I reached into my wallet and pulled out what I always used to solve problems: money, a thick roll of euros that could have fed a family for months. I held it out to her like some kind of offering to a deity I didn't understand. She looked at the money, then back at my face, and did something that shattered my worldview completely. She shook her head, not with anger or resentment, but with a quiet dignity that made my expensive gesture feel like an insult. The baby had stopped crying and was now staring at me with eyes that seemed too knowing for his tiny face. "Please," I said, my voice sounding foreign in this place. "Take it, for the child." She spoke then, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the night air like a blade. "Money without heart is just paper, mister. This little one needs more than what your wallet can give." Her English was accented but perfect, each word carefully chosen. I stood there, humiliated and confused, my arm still extended with the rejected euros. No one had ever refused my money. No one had ever looked at my wealth and found it wanting. But this girl, this child, living in conditions I couldn't even imagine, had just taught me my first lesson in what real poverty looked like. It wasn't just about lacking money. It was about lacking everything else I'd taken for granted. I drove home that night in complete silence, her words echoing in my head. The familiar luxury of my penthouse felt suffocating when I walked through the door. The imported marble floors seemed cold under my feet, the crystal chandeliers too bright, the silence too empty. I poured myself a glass of 20-year-old whiskey and stood on my balcony, staring out at the twinkling lights of Mykonos harbor. But all I could see were those blue eyes, and all I could hear was her voice saying money without heart was just paper. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, felt the weight of her gaze, heard the baby's weak cries. By morning, I had made a decision that my old self would have called madness. I was going back. Have you ever become obsessed with something you couldn't understand? Something that called to you despite every logical reason to stay away? That's what happened to me over the next few weeks. Every day, sometimes twice a day, I found myself driving back to that alley. Not in the Lamborghini anymore. I'd bought an old, unremarkable sedan that wouldn't draw attention. I told myself I was just checking on them, making sure they were safe, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying. I couldn't stay away. I learned her routine. She appeared in the mornings around 8, carrying the baby and a small bag of what looked like medical supplies. She would sit in the same spot, always clean despite her circumstances, always gentle with the child she cared for. Sometimes she sang to him. Sometimes she just talked, her voice a constant stream of comfort in both Greek and English. I discovered she was teaching him words, counting his fingers, describing the world around them with a hope that broke my heart. After a week of watching from a distance, I finally worked up the courage to approach her again. This time, I came empty-handed. No money, no grand gestures, just questions that had been eating me alive. "What's his name?" I asked, nodding toward the baby. She looked up at me with those devastating eyes, seeming to weigh whether I was worth her time. "Nicias," she said finally. "His name is Nicias, and yours, Melania." The name fell from her lips like music. Melania Kostas. I crouched down to her level, ignoring how my expensive pants touched the dirty ground. "I'm Alexandros. I keep coming back here because I can't stop thinking about you too. About how you're surviving, about what happened to bring you here." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me squirm. "You want to know our story?" she said finally. "But stories have power, Alexandros. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of power?" The way she said my name sent shivers down my spine, like she could see straight through to my soul and was deciding whether it was worth saving. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Nicias is my brother," she began, adjusting the thin blanket around the baby's shoulders. "Our parents died 4 months ago. Construction accident at one of the big hotels they were building for tourists. A crane fell. Papa died instantly. Mama lived for 3 days in the hospital before her body gave up fighting." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this devastating information hit me like a physical blow. No tears, no self-pity, just the brutal truth spoken with a strength that shamed. Me, we had no other family. The state was supposed to help, supposed to find us a home, but the man assigned to our case, he had other plans for the money meant for children like us. So here we are, making our own way because sometimes that's all you can do. I spent the next hour listening to her talk about survival in ways I'd never imagined. How she'd learned to find clean water, where to get food that wasn't spoiled, which doorways were safe to sleep in when the weather turned bad. She spoke about caring for Nicias like it was the most natural thing in the world, even though she was barely more than a child herself. When I left that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just met someone extraordinary. Not because of her circumstances, but because of how she'd risen above them. She was 13 years old and more capable than most adults I knew, more honest than anyone in my circle, more genuine than I'd ever been in my entire privileged life. That evening, I called Dimitris to cancel our usual dinner plans. "I need to do something," I told him, though I couldn't explain what that something was. "You sound different, Alex," he said, using the nickname that suddenly felt too casual, too light, for the weight I was carrying. "Everything okay?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I really don't know." Instead of heading to my usual restaurant where they knew my order before I sat down, I drove to a small taverna near Melania's alley. The owner, a weathered man with kind eyes, served me simple food that tasted better than anything I'd eaten at my 5-star establishments. As I sat there, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood that actually felt alive, I realized something terrifying. My life of luxury hadn't just been empty, it had been a lie. The next day, I sought out the local church. I'm not a religious man, never had been, but something was pulling me toward answers I couldn't find in my usual haunts. The building was small and old, nothing like the grand cathedral where my family held their ceremonial appearances. This place smelled of incense and honest prayers, of people who came seeking comfort rather than showing off their designer clothes. I found the priest, Father Christos Makris, tending to a small garden behind the church. He was older, maybe 60, with gentle hands and eyes that held the same quality of seeing too much that I'd noticed in Melania. When I introduced myself, giving only my first name, he invited me to sit on a stone bench surrounded by herbs and olive trees. "You have the look of someone carrying questions," he said in accented English, somehow knowing I needed to speak in a language that felt less connected to my privileged Greek upbringing. Questions about purpose, perhaps, about what your life means. I found myself telling him about Melania and Nicias, about the money she'd refused, about the guilt that was eating me alive. Father Christos listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. "Ah, yes, I know the children you speak of," he said when I finished. "Melania brings Nicias here sometimes for the free clinic we run on Wednesdays. She's remarkable, that one. Old soul in a young body. But you're not here just because of them, are you?" He was right, of course. "I don't know who I am anymore," I admitted. "I've spent my whole life thinking I was blessed, thinking I deserved everything I had. But seeing them, seeing how she lives with such grace when she has nothing, it's making me question everything." Father Christos smiled sadly. "Wealth can be a gift or a curse, my son. It depends on what you do with it. But I suspect you're beginning to understand that what we own often ends up owning us." We talked for over an hour about responsibility, about privilege, about the difference between charity and justice. He told me stories of other children in similar situations, of families destroyed by systems that were supposed to protect them. Each story was another weight added to the growing pile of guilt and anger in my chest. If you truly want to help, if you truly want to change, then you need to understand something important, Father Christos said as our conversation was winding down. The problems these children face aren't just about poverty. They're about power. About people in positions of authority who have forgotten that their duty is to serve, not to be served. Something in his tone made me look up sharply. There was a warning there, a darkness behind his kind eyes that sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" I asked. Father Christos looked around carefully, as if making sure we were alone, then leaned closer. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and when he spoke, every word felt like a stone dropping into still water. "My son, you still haven't seen anything of what really happens here." Father Christos's words haunted me for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his whispered warning echoing in my mind like a prayer I couldn't escape. "You still haven't seen anything of what really happens here. What could be worse than children living on the streets, surviving on scraps and hope? What darkness was lurking beneath the surface of a system that was supposed to protect the most vulnerable?" I couldn't focus on anything else. My usual routine of board meetings and social events felt like performing in a play where I'd forgotten all my lines. When Dimitris invited me to his yacht for the weekend, I made excuses. When my Aunt Thalia called to discuss expanding our shipping routes, I barely listened to her carefully calculated words about profit margins and market opportunities. Everything that had once seemed important now felt like background noise to the real symphony playing in my head. A symphony conducted by a 13-year-old girl with eyes like the deep sea. I started spending more time in that neighborhood, not just visiting Melania and Nicias, but walking the streets, observing, learning. The more I saw, the more questions burned in my chest. There were other children, some even younger than Melania, living in doorways and abandoned buildings. Street kids with hollow cheeks and weary eyes, moving through the shadows like ghosts that society had decided not to see. Have you ever felt like you were living in two different worlds at the same time? Like you were split down the middle, with one foot in each reality? That's how I felt as I navigated between my penthouse and these forgotten streets. In the morning, I'd wake up in silk sheets worth more than most people's monthly rent. By afternoon, I'd be sitting on broken concrete, listening to stories that would have been impossible for my old self to believe. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that I finally got the courage to ask Melania the question that had been eating at me since my conversation with Father Chris. We were sitting in our usual spot, Nikia's sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the chaos of the city around us. She'd grown comfortable with my presence over the past few weeks, even seemed to look forward to our conversations, but I could tell she was still holding back, still protecting secrets that weighed heavy on her thin shoulders. "Melania," I said, my voice careful and quiet. "Father Christos told me that there are things happening here that go beyond just poverty. Things involving the people who are supposed to help children like you and Nikias." Her entire body went rigid. The easy smile that had been playing at the corners of her mouth disappeared, replaced by something that looked like fear. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared down at her sleeping brother with an intensity that made my stomach clench. "You really want to know?" she asked finally, her voice so soft I had to lean forward to hear her. "You really want to understand why children like us sometimes just disappear?" The word disappear hit me like ice water. "What do you mean, disappear?" She looked around carefully, as if making sure no one was listening, then fixed me with those devastating blue eyes. "There's a man, Yanis Papadakis. He works for the social services department. On paper, he's supposed to help orphan children find homes, make sure we have food and shelter and education. But Yanis, he has different ideas about what children are worth." My hands clenched into fists without me realizing it. What kind of different ideas? The money that's supposed to feed us, clothe us, keep us safe. Most of it never reaches us. Yanis has been stealing from the government programs for years, creating fake families on paper, claiming expenses for children who don't exist, or who, she paused, swallowing hard, or who aren't around anymore to need the money. "Where do the children go?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Some get adopted by families who don't ask too many questions about paperwork. Families who want children for the wrong reasons. Others just vanish completely. Yanis tells everyone they ran away, went to live with distant relatives, got placed with families in other cities. But I know better. I keep track." She reached into her small bag and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages yellowed in edges, frayed from constant handling. My heart stopped when I saw what was inside. Names, dozens of names written in careful script, with dates next to them and small notes in the margins. Children's names, children who had disappeared. "This is everyone I've known who's gone missing in the past 2 years, she said, her finger tracing down the list. 37 children, some as young as 5 years old, the official records say. They've all been placed in loving homes or reunited with family. But I've checked, Alexandros. I've asked around, looked for them. None of these children exist anywhere anymore." I stared at the notebook like it was a bomb that might explode at any moment. 37 children. The number rolled round in my head, too big to fully comprehend. Why hasn't anyone reported this? Why isn't anyone investigating? Melanian's laugh was bitter and adult, completely wrong coming from someone her age. Who would believe a street kid over a respected government official? Who would listen to children who have no voices, no families to fight for them. Giannis is careful. He only takes the ones no one will miss. The ones like me and Nicias, who have nowhere else to go. But you're still here, I pointed out. You and Nicias are still safe. For now, she said quietly. But Giannis knows about us. He's been watching, waiting. I think the only reason he hasn't acted yet is because I've been careful to stay visible, to make sure people in the neighborhood know our faces. Father Christos helps too, though he can only do so much. But, Alexandros, I won't be 13 forever. Soon I'll age out of the system, and Nicias will be more vulnerable. We're living on borrowed time. The rage that filled me then was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the petty anger I'd felt when business deals went wrong or when someone scratched my car. This was something primal and burning, a fury that demanded action. Here was this incredible girl, this child who had shown me more wisdom and strength than I'd encountered in my entire privileged life. And she was being hunted by a predator who wore the mask of a helper. I need to meet this Giannis, I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. No, Melania said immediately, clutching Nicias closer to her chest. You don't understand. He's dangerous. He has connections, people who protect him because they benefit from what he does. If he knows you're asking questions, but I was already pulling out my phone, my mind racing with plans. For the first time since I'd met Melania, I was grateful for the power that came with my name and my money. If Giannis Papadakis was hiding behind government bureaucracy and corrupt connections, then he was about to learn what it felt like to be investigated by someone with unlimited resources and a burning need for justice. That evening, I made calls, not to my usual contacts in the social circles where reputation and image mattered most, but to people who dealt with harder truths. Private investigators, journalists, lawyers who specialized in cases the system preferred to ignore. I used my connections, my money, my influence, everything I'd previously used for selfish gain, and pointed it all like a weapon toward one target, finding out everything there was to know about Giannis Papadakis within 48 hours. I had a file thick enough to choke on. Giannis wasn't just stealing money from children's aid programs. He was part of a network that included other social workers, local politicians, even judges who rubber-stamped adoption papers without proper oversight. The scale of it was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of euros had been diverted from programs meant to help the most vulnerable children in Greece. And that was just the money we could trace. But when I tried to dig deeper, to understand where the missing children had actually gone, I hit walls that felt suspiciously well constructed. Phone calls went unreturned. Documents were suddenly unavailable for review. People who had been eager to help when I mentioned payment became nervous and evasive when I mentioned specific names. It was during one of these frustrating dead ends that I made a call I should have made weeks earlier. My Aunt Thalia had always been the political brain of our family operation. If anyone would know how to navigate the corruption I was uncovering, it would be her. We met for lunch at her favorite restaurant in Kolonaki, surrounded by the kind of wealthy Athenians who treated politics like an expensive hobby. Alexandros, darling, she said, air-kissing my cheeks with the practiced efficiency of someone who attended 3 social events per day. You look terrible. Are you sleeping? Eating? When was the last time you had a proper meal instead of whatever street food you've been experimenting with? Even Thalia knew about my changed habits. The Greek upper class was smaller than most people, realized, and gossip traveled faster than news. I'm fine, Aunt Thalia, but I need to ask you about something serious. I laid out what I'd learned about Giannis and the missing children, watching her face carefully for any sign of surprise or outrage. Instead, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Recognition. She knew. Not just knew about it, but knew about it in the way that suggested she'd been aware for far longer than I'd been investigating. "Oh, Alexandros," she said with a sigh, setting down her wine glass with the delicate precision that characterized everything she did. "What have you gotten yourself into?" "You know about this," I said. It wasn't a question. Of course, I know about it. Did you think corruption of this scale could exist without people in our position being aware? The question isn't what I know. Darling, the question is why you're suddenly interested in problems that have existed for years. The casual way she discussed children's lives, like they were business expenses, made my blood run cold. How can you know about this and not do anything? Talia leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone she used when explaining complex financial concepts to people she considered intellectually inferior. Because sometimes, nephew, the system works exactly as it's designed to work. Those children were going to be problems for society anyway. This way, at least some good comes from their situations. I stared at her, this woman who had helped raise me, who had taught me about business and politics and the responsibilities that came with wealth, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Or maybe I was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. "Good," I repeated. "What possible good comes from children disappearing? The money that would have been wasted on failed social programs gets redirected to projects that actually benefit the economy. Children who would have grown up to be drains on society find alternative purposes, and people like us maintain the stability necessary to keep Greece functioning." She reached across the table and patted my hand like I was still a child. "It's not pretty, Alexandros, but it's necessary." I pulled my hand away as if she'd burned me. "Those children have names, Thalia. They have futures that were stolen from them. They have nothing," she said, her voice growing colder. "They never had anything." We simply acknowledged that reality and made sure their situations served a greater purpose. "What greater purpose?" I demanded. Thalia smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "That, my dear nephew, is need to know information. And right now, you don't need to know." I left that lunch feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Everything I thought I understood about my family, about the sources of our wealth, about the systems that had protected and privileged me my entire life, was crumbling like a house built on sand. But even then, even with the evidence mounting that corruption reached into the highest levels of society, I still didn't understand how deep the rabbit hole went. It wasn't until Melania showed me the full list, until she pointed to one specific name written in her careful handwriting, that I realized the true scope of what I was up against. When I saw that name, when the connections clicked into place in my mind like puzzle pieces forming a picture I didn't want to see, my whole world exploded, because that name, written in fading ink in a 13-year-old girl's notebook of the disappeared, was someone I knew. Someone whose adoption I had personally celebrated at a family gathering just 6 months earlier. The name staring back at me from Melania's notebook was Sofia Vassos, 8 years old, dark curly hair, missing. For 6 months, according to the careful date notation in Melania's handwriting. But I knew exactly where Sofia Vassos was supposed to be, because I had attended her adoption celebration at my cousin Elena's villa in Santorini last Christmas. My hands shook as I pointed to the name. "Melania, this child. Are you absolutely certain she's missing?" She studied my face with those penetrating blue eyes, immediately picking up on the change in my voice. "You know her." It wasn't a question. Melania had become an expert at reading people, at detecting the subtle shifts that meant danger or opportunity or truth. I nodded, my throat so tight I could barely speak. "I was at her adoption party," I whispered. "My family, we celebrated when she found her new home. There were pictures, speeches about giving orphaned children second chances. The adoptive parents seemed so happy, so grateful." Melania's expression hardened into something far too mature for her age. "Tell me about these adoptive parents. What did they look like? How did they act with Sophia?" I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember details I'd barely paid attention to at the time. It had been just another family obligation, another social event where I'd made appearances and small talk while thinking about which party I'd attend later that night. But now, searching my memory with desperate intensity, I could recall things that should have raised red flags. The father was older, maybe 60, very well dressed, quiet. He barely interacted with Sophia during the whole party. The mother seemed nervous, kept checking her phone. And Sophia, The memory hit me like a physical blow. She looked terrified. I thought she was just shy, overwhelmed by all the attention. But she wouldn't speak, wouldn't smile, kept trying to hide behind the social worker who brought her. "What was the social worker's name?" Melania asked. Though I could tell from her tone, she already knew the answer. "Yanis," I said, the name tasting like poison on my tongue. Yanis Papadakis. He gave a beautiful speech about finding loving homes for children who needed them most. Melania's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Yanis is very good at beautiful speeches. It's everything else he does that's ugly." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of this revelation settling over us like a shroud. I was connected to this horror not just as an observer, but as a participant. My family had celebrated while a child was being delivered to people who had no intention of loving her. We had toasted with champagne worth more than most people's monthly salaries while an 80-year-old girl disappeared into a nightmare I was only beginning to understand. "I need to find out where she really went," I said, pulling out my phone. "I need to trace what happened after that party." "Alexandros, no." Melania grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "If you start asking questions about specific children, specific cases, you'll alert them that someone is investigating. That puts all of us in danger." But I was beyond rational thought. The rage that had been building inside me for weeks had found a focal point, and I couldn't think about anything except the image of little Sophia's terrified face at that party. I started making calls, using every connection I had to trace the adoption paperwork, to find out who the adoptive parents really were, where they lived, what had happened to one small girl who should have been safe. What I discovered over the next 3 days made me physically sick. The adoptive parents existed on paper only. The address listed for them led to an empty apartment that had been rented for exactly 1 month, 6 months ago. The references provided were all fake. Even their identity documents had been forged, with a sophistication that suggested serious money and serious connections. But the most damning discovery came when I hired a private investigator to dig deeper into the financial trail. The adoption fees, the legal costs, even the catering for the celebration party had all been paid for by a shell company that, after following a maze of corporate structures and offshore accounts, traced back to one source. Dimitriou Holdings, my family's investment arm. I sat in my car outside the investigator's office, staring at the documents that proved my family's money had directly funded what amounted to child trafficking. The beautiful speech Yanis had given about loving homes. We had paid for it. The fake parents who had taken Sophia, we had funded their performance. The entire elaborate charade had been subsidized by blood money that I had inherited without question. The drive to Thalia's office in downtown Athens passed in a blur of rage and betrayal. I stormed past her secretary, ignoring protests about appointments and schedules, and slammed the door to her private office hard enough to rattle the expensive artwork on her walls. "We need to talk," I said, dropping the investigative report on her polished mahogany desk. "Right now." Thalia looked up from her computer with the patient expression she reserved for my more dramatic moments. But when she saw the papers, when she read the first few lines, her carefully controlled mask slipped for just a moment, long enough for me to see that she wasn't surprised by what I'd discovered. She was surprised that I'd discovered it. "Oh, Alexandros," she said softly, closing the folder without reading the rest. "I had hoped you would let this obsession go." "Obsession?" My voice cracked like a whip. "You call wanting to understand why our family money is funding child trafficking an obsession? I call it naive idealism from someone who has never had to make the hard choices that keep empires like ours functioning." She stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the Athens skyline with the air of someone contemplating difficult decisions. "Do you think wealth like ours maintains itself through charitable thoughts and good intentions? I think there's a difference between hard business choices and literally buying children for people who mean them harm." Thalia turned back to me, and for the first time in my life, I saw her without any pretense. No social masks, no political calculations, just the cold core of someone who had made peace with being a monster long ago. "Those children were going to suffer anyway," she said matter-of-factly. "At least this way, their suffering serves a purpose. The network we're part of doesn't just handle adoption placements, Alexandros. It handles disposal of problems. Witnesses who see too much. Competitors who threaten important business deals. Politicians who won't accept reasonable compromises. Children are just one small part of a much larger system that keeps chaos at bay." "You're talking about murder," I said, the words barely audible. "I'm talking about pragmatism, about understanding that sometimes unpleasant choices have to be made for the greater good. Your grandfather understood this. Your father understood this. I had hoped that when you inherited your position, you would understand it too." The revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't new corruption that had infected my family's business. This was the foundation our empire had been built on. Every yacht, every penthouse, every privilege I'd enjoyed had been paid for with the suffering of people who couldn't fight back. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "How many what? How many children? How many people? How many lives have we destroyed to maintain our lifestyle?" Thalia studied me for a long moment, her head tilted like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. "You really want to know? You really want to carry that weight?" I nodded, even though every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to return to my ignorant bliss, to pretend this conversation had never happened. "Hundreds," she said simply. "Over the past 20 years, hundreds of problems have been solved through our network. And before you get all righteous about it, remember that every euro you've spent, every breath of clean air you've enjoyed on your yachts, every moment of safety and security you've taken for granted has been purchased with those solutions." I felt like I was falling through space, like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet and I was tumbling through darkness with no end in sight. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about the sources of my privilege, had been built on a foundation of horrors that my mind struggled to process. What happens to me now? I asked. Now that I know. That depends entirely on what you do with the knowledge, Talia said, her voice carrying a warning that made my blood freeze. This information is dangerous, Alexandros. Not just to us, but to you. People who know too much about how our world really works have a tendency to become problems themselves. And we've already established how we handle problems. I stumbled out of her office in a daze, barely aware of my surroundings, as I made my way to my car. The streets of Athens looked different now, like I was seeing them through new eyes. Every well-dressed person walking past could be part of the network. Every government building could be hiding more corruption. Every child playing in the parks could be potential prey for predators with enough money to buy protection from the very people supposed to safeguard them. I drove straight to Melania's alley, needing to see her face, needing to ground myself in something real and honest after the nightmare of revelations I'd just endured. But when I reached our usual meeting spot, it was empty. No Melanian sitting on her piece of cardboard. No baby crying softly in her arms. No blue eyes to anchor me to sanity. I waited for 3 hours, telling myself they were just running late, that they'd gone somewhere for food or supplies. But as the sun began to set and the alley filled with lengthening shadows, a cold dread settled in my stomach. I found Father Christos in his church, lighting candles for evening prayers. When he saw my face, he immediately set down his lighter and motioned for me to sit in one of the front pews. "Where are they?" I asked, without preamble. "Where are Melania and Nikias?" The priest's kind eyes filled with sorrow that told me everything I needed to know before he spoke a single word. "They came to me this morning." Melania said someone had been watching them, following them. She was frightened, more frightened than I'd ever seen her. I tried to convince her to stay here, to let me protect them, but what? She said she couldn't put me in danger too. She said she knew too much, had seen too much, had talked to the wrong person about things that were supposed to stay hidden. Father Christos looked directly at me. "She was protecting you, Alexandros. And by protecting you, she sacrificed herself." The church spun around me as the implications crashed home. Melania had figured out that my investigation had triggered something, had made someone nervous enough to act. The girl who had opened my eyes to truth had paid the price for my privileged blindness. As I sat there in that small church, surrounded by the smell of incense and the weight of centuries of prayers, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. But somehow, I knew exactly who had sent it before I even read the words. "Your education is about to become much more expensive. If you want to see the girl and her brother again, you'll stop asking questions and start following instructions. Tonight, midnight. Come alone, or they disappear forever." The message included an address I didn't recognize, but I knew I would go, because in the space of a few hours, everything I thought I understood about power and privilege and the price of knowledge had been turned inside out. And now the only person who had ever shown me what genuine courage looked like was somewhere in the darkness, paying for my sins with her freedom and possibly her life. If you've ever wondered how far you would go to save someone who saved you first, who showed you truths about yourself that changed everything, then you know exactly how I felt sitting in that church as midnight approached, knowing I was about to walk into a trap but unable to make any other choice. Because sometimes, when You discover your entire existence has been built on other people's suffering. The only thing left to do is suffer yourself, and hope that somewhere in that suffering, you might find something that looks like redemption. The address led me to an abandoned warehouse in Piraeus, the kind of place where legitimate businesses went to die, and illegitimate ones thrived in. The shadows. My hands shook as I parked my car 3 blocks away, the engine ticking as it cooled in the Mediterranean night air. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to call the police, to bring backup, to do anything except walk alone into what was obviously a trap. But the text had been clear. Come alone, or they disappear forever. Have you ever made a choice knowing it would probably destroy you, but made it anyway because the alternative was watching someone you cared about suffer for your mistakes? That's what I felt walking through those empty streets, my footsteps echoing off warehouse walls like a countdown to Judgment Day. The building looked abandoned from the outside, windows boarded up and graffiti covering most surfaces. But there was a single door propped open with a wooden block, spilling yellow light onto the cracked pavement like an invitation to hell. I checked my phone one last time, saw it was exactly midnight, and stepped inside. The warehouse had been converted into something that looked like a twisted version of a corporate boardroom. Folding chairs arranged in a circle around a single table, harsh fluorescent lights casting everything in sickly illumination. And sitting at that table, calm as if he were discussing the weather, was Giannis Papadakis. He was smaller than I'd expected. Maybe 5'8", with thinning hair and the soft build of someone who solved problems with words rather than physical force. But his eyes were cold in a way that made my skin crawl, like looking into the face of a shark that had learned to walk upright and wear human clothes. Alexandros Dimitriou, he said, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from him. Thank you for being punctual. I appreciate precision in my business dealings. Where are they? I demanded, remaining standing. Where are Melania and Nikias? Safe, he said simply. For now, please, sit. We have a great deal to discuss, and I prefer civilized conversations. Against every instinct, I sat down. The chair was uncomfortable, probably by design, keeping me off balance while he maintained control of the situation. On the table between us was a thick manila folder and what looked like a contract. I have to admit, I'm impressed, Giannis continued, opening the folder to reveal photographs. Pictures of me talking to Melania, visiting Father Christos, meeting with investigators, sitting in my aunt's office. Most people in your position would have lost interest after the first week, but you've shown remarkable persistence in your charitable endeavors. The casual way he discussed surveilling me made rage bubble up in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Melania and Nikias were depending on me to be smart, not just angry. You've been making some very expensive mistakes, Alexandros, Giannis said, turning the photographs so I could see them clearly. Hiring investigators, asking uncomfortable questions, disturbing relationships that have taken years to cultivate. Relationships built on stolen children and murdered families, I shot back. Relationships built on necessity, he corrected. Do you have any idea how much money flows through the systems I manage? How many important people depend on those systems functioning smoothly? Your little crusade hasn't just threatened me, Alexandros. It's threatened an entire network of very powerful, very dangerous people. He slid the contract across the table toward me. Fortunately, we're reasonable people. We understand that sometimes good intentions lead to poor decisions. So we're prepared to offer you a choice. I looked down at the papers without touching them, trying to read the legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. But the basic terms were clear enough. I would cease all investigations immediately. I would transfer a substantial sum of money to accounts Yanis specified. I would publicly support his work and the adoption programs he managed. In exchange, Melania and Nikias would be placed with a loving family, and I would be allowed to return to my previous life with no further interference. What kind of loving family? I asked, though I already knew the answer would make me sick. The kind that asks no questions and leaves no traces, Yanis said with a smile that belonged. In nightmares, the same kind that welcomed little Sophia Vassos with such enthusiasm. The mention of Sophia's name hit me like a physical blow. I thought of her terrified face at that adoption party, how she'd tried to hide behind Yanis while my family celebrated her placement. How naive I'd been to think the fear in her eyes was just shyness. "You're insane if you think I'll sign that," I said. "I think you'll find the alternative much less appealing," Yanis replied, pulling out his phone. He showed me a video that made my blood turn to ice. Melania and Nikias in what looked like a basement room, concrete walls, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Melania was holding her brother close, singing softly to keep him calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes even through the grainy phone screen. "They're comfortable enough for now," Yanis said, putting the phone away. "But comfort is a temporary thing, Alexandros, especially for children who know too much about things they shouldn't have learned." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to understand your position," Yanis said, leaning forward. "You are not the hero in this story. You are not some avenging angel come to save the innocent. You are a spoiled rich boy who stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than his privileged mind can comprehend." He opened another folder, this one filled with financial documents that took me several moments to understand. Bank transfers, investment records, corporate structures that traced money flowing from my family's accounts to a dozen different criminal enterprises. Not just child trafficking, but drug smuggling, arms dealing, human trafficking for adult victims, money laundering for terrorist organizations. Your family's wealth isn't just connected to our network, Alexandros. It's integral to our network. The Dimitriou shipping lines don't just carry legitimate cargo. Your offshore accounts don't just hide taxes. Your political connections don't just ensure favorable business regulations. Each revelation hit me like a hammer blow. I stared at documents showing my own signature on papers I barely remembered signing, authorizing transfers that I'd been told were routine business expenses. My trust in Thalia's financial management had made me complicit in horrors I'd never imagined. 30% of your family's income over the past 5 years has come from activities that would put you in prison for life if the authorities ever developed an interest in investigating, Yanis continued. Which means you have 2 choices. You can sign this contract, take the deal I'm offering, and continue living your comfortable life while we clean up the mess you've made. Or you can refuse and discover exactly how quickly a man with your resources can lose everything when the right pressure is applied to the right people. "You're blackmailing me with my own money," I said, finally understanding the full scope of the trap I'd walked into. "I'm offering you a partnership," Yanis corrected. "Your family has been our silent partner for years, without your knowledge. Now we're simply bringing you into the fold, officially. Think of it as a promotion." He gestured around the warehouse, and for the first time I noticed we weren't alone. Men in expensive suits stood in the shadows near the walls, close enough to intervene if I tried anything stupid. far enough away to maintain the illusion that this was a civilized business meeting. Who else knows? I asked. How many people are part of this? More than you can fight, Yanis said simply. Judges, politicians, police commissioners, business leaders, religious figures, people you've known your entire life, people you've trusted, people who have been at your family's dinner table. The network extends further than you can imagine. Alexandros, which is why fighting it is not just futile, it's suicidal. I thought about Father Christos, about his warnings that there were things I hadn't seen yet. Had he known how deep this went? Was he part of it too, or just another victim trying to protect what little good he could salvage from a corrupt system? I need proof they're alive, I said. I need to know Melania and Nikias are actually safe before I agree to anything. Yanis smiled and made a gesture to one of his men, who disappeared through a door I hadn't noticed before. A few minutes later, he returned with a small device that looked like a two-way radio. Speak, Yanis said, handing me the device. Melanian, I said, my voice cracking. Melanian, are you there? Her voice came through the static, weak, but unmistakably hers. Alexandros, is that really you? I'm here, I said, tears streaming down my face before I could stop them. I'm going to get you out of there. Don't, she said, and there was something in her tone that made me freeze. Don't do whatever they're asking you to do. Nikias and we knew this might happen. We talked about it. We'd rather disappear than have you become like them. Melanian, please, you showed us what kindness looks like, she continued, her voice getting stronger. You showed us that not everyone with power uses it to hurt people. Don't let them take that away from you. Don't let them make you into something you're not. The radio went silent, and Yanis took it back with the casual efficiency of someone who had orchestrated similar scenes many times before. Touching, he said, but ultimately irrelevant. The girl doesn't understand the realities of the situation. You do. You know what happens to people who refuse to cooperate with us. You've seen the evidence of what we're capable of. I stared at the contract, at the signatures and official seals that would transform me from an unknowing accomplice into a willing participant. One signature would save Melania and Nikias, at least temporarily. It would also damn whatever remained of my soul and make me complicit in every future horror the network committed. But as I sat there in that warehouse, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of ships in Piraeus harbor, I realized something that surprised me. For the first time in my privileged life, I was facing a choice that actually mattered. Not between different investments or vacation destinations or which yacht to buy, but between saving the people I cared about and preserving whatever integrity I had left. You have until tomorrow night to decide, Yanis said, standing up and straightening his tie. Sign the contract and transfer the initial payment, and the children will be released to their new family by the weekend. Refuse, and they'll simply be added to the list of problems that required permanent solutions. As his men began filing out of the warehouse, leaving me alone with the contract and the weight of an impossible decision, Yanis paused at the door. Oh, and Alexandros, in case you're thinking about involving the authorities, you should know that tomorrow's newspaper will carry a very interesting story about financial irregularities in the Dimitriou shipping empire. Nothing that can't be explained away if you cooperate, but certainly enough to raise uncomfortable questions if you don't. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the harsh fluorescent light, with a choice that would define not just my future, but the future of two innocent children whose only crime had been trusting me enough to believe that someone with power might actually use it to help rather than harm. I sat there for hours, staring at those papers, knowing that whatever I decided would change everything forever. Because sometimes the difference between a hero and a villain isn't what you're willing to do for strangers, but what you're willing to sacrifice for the people who matter most. And as dawn began to creep through the boarded-up windows of that warehouse, I finally understood that the real test of character comes not when the choices are easy, but when they're impossible. But then I remembered Melania's words. You showed us what kindness looks like. Don't let them make you into something you're not. And I realized that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't saving someone from immediate danger, but refusing to compromise your soul in the process. Because what good would it do to rescue her body if I lost everything that made me worthy of her respect in the first place? That's when I made the decision that would either destroy us all or set us free. I walked out of that warehouse without signing anything, but I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to the offices of Elena Vasquez, the investigative journalist I'd been working with. If Giannis wanted to play dirty, if he wanted to threaten me with exposure, then he was about to learn what real exposure looked like. Over the next 18 hours, Elena and I worked with a fury born of desperation. We compiled everything: the financial records, the missing children reports, the connections between my family's money and Giannis's network, the evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Greek society. We prepared a story that would blow the lid off the entire operation. Consequences be damned. But we needed more than just documents. We needed someone on the inside willing to testify, someone whose word would carry enough weight to bring down people with serious power. That's when I thought of Father Christos, and I realized why his warnings had been so specific, why he'd known so much about what was really happening in his neighborhood. I found him in his church again, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 other priests sat with him in the front pew, their faces grave as they discussed something in hushed tones. When they saw me approach, they fell silent. Alexandros, Father Christos said, standing up, I've been expecting you. Father, I need your help. I need you to tell the authorities what you know about the missing children, about Giannis and his network. The old priest smiled sadly. My son, I've been telling the authorities for 3 years. The problem isn't that they don't know. The problem is that they don't care. Then we make them care, I said, pulling out my phone to show him Elena's contact. Information, we go public. We make so much noise that they can't ignore it anymore. And what about Melania and Nikki, miss? One of the other priests asked. If you expose this network while they're still prisoners, what do you think will happen to them? The question hit me like a physical blow. In my rage and determination to bring down the system, I'd almost lost sight of the 2 people who mattered most. Going public might expose the corruption, but it would also sign their death warrants. There might be another way, Father Christos said quietly, but it would require you to trust me completely, and it would put you in more danger than you've faced so far. Tell me. The network Giannis works for, it has one weakness. Like all criminal organizations, it depends on trust and fear to maintain control. If that trust is broken, if the fear is redirected toward the leaders instead of toward their victims, the whole system can collapse very quickly. He explained his plan, and as I listened, I realized that Father Christos hadn't just been observing the corruption in his neighborhood. He'd been building a resistance movement. Other priests, social workers who still had consciences, even some police officers who were tired of being part of the problem instead of the solution. They'd been gathering evidence, building cases, waiting for the right moment to strike. But we needed someone with your resources, your connections, your access to the financial networks that keep this system functioning. Father Christos continued. Someone willing to sacrifice everything to do what's right. What do you need me to do? Tomorrow night, you're going to sign that contract. You're going to become an official partner in their network. But you're also going to be wearing a wire, and every conversation, every transaction, every piece of evidence you gather will be transmitted directly to law enforcement agencies that aren't corrupt. The plan was insane. It was dangerous beyond belief. It required me to walk deeper into the monster's den while pretending to be one of them. But it was also the only chance Melania and Nikias had, and the only way to bring down a system that had been destroying children for years. If they catch me, I said, they'll kill me. Yes, Father Christos said simply. They will. But if you don't try, they'll kill you anyway, along with everyone else who knows the truth. At least this way, your death might mean something. That night, I sat in my penthouse for what I knew might be the last time, looking out at the harbor, where my yachts bobbed in the moonlight. Tomorrow, I would either be dead, or everything I'd ever owned would be gone, seized by authorities as evidence of my family's crimes. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly wealthy. Not because of what I owned, but because of what I was willing to sacrifice. If you've ever wondered what courage really looks like, let me tell you, it's not the absence of fear. It's being absolutely terrified and doing what's right anyway. It's trading your comfortable lies for dangerous truths. It's choosing love over self-preservation, even when the cost might be everything you've ever known. The next evening, I walked back into that warehouse wearing a wire that could get me killed and carrying documents that would make me an official partner in child trafficking. My hands shook as I signed the contract, transferred the money, shook hands with monsters who thought they owned me. But what they didn't know was that every word they spoke, every transaction they made, every crime they confessed was being recorded and transmitted to agents who were positioned throughout the city, ready to move the moment they had enough evidence. That it took 6 hours. 6 hours of the most terrifying acting performance of my life, pretending to be enthusiastic about joining their network while secretly gathering the evidence that would destroy them. 6 hours of listening to them describe their plans for Melania and Nikias in terms that made my blood run cold while I smiled and nodded like it was just business. And then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the warehouse doors exploded inward and armed agents poured in like an avenging army. The look of shock on Jonas's face as he realized he'd been betrayed was worth every terrifying second I'd endured. The operation was coordinated across 12 countries, involving shipping networks, adoption agencies, political figures, and criminal organizations that stretched from Athens to Amsterdam to Dubai. Over 200 arrests were made in a single night. Assets worth millions of euros were frozen. And most importantly, 63 children who had been classified as missing were found alive and returned to safety. Melania and Nikias were among them. I found them in a hospital room 2 days later, both receiving treatment for malnutrition and trauma, but alive and together. When Melania saw me walk through the door, she started crying. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief that somehow, impossibly, we had all survived the nightmare. "You did it," she whispered as I held her hand. "You saved us." "No," I said, my own tears flowing freely for the first time in years. "You saved me." The legal proceedings took months. My family's assets were seized, investigated, and eventually liquidated to provide compensation for victims of the network. Dalia was arrested and convicted, along with dozens of others who had profited from the suffering of children. Yanis received a life sentence without possibility of parole. I testified at every trial, told my story to anyone who would listen, used my platform to expose the systems that allow such horrors to exist. The media called me a whistleblower, a hero, a man who gave up everything to do what was right. But I knew better. I was just someone who had been lucky enough to have his eyes opened by a 13-year-old girl with the courage to refuse my money and demand something more valuable: my humanity. Today, 3 years later, I live in a small apartment in the same neighborhood where I first met Melania. I work for a legitimate non-profit organization that helps street children find safe homes and real opportunities. I don't have yachts anymore, or penthouses, or Swiss bank accounts, but I have something infinitely more valuable than knowledge. That when it mattered most, when everything was on the line, I chose love over fear, truth over comfort, sacrifice over safety. Melania is 16 now, a brilliant student with dreams of becoming a lawyer so she can protect other children like her brother. Nikias is healthy and happy, a little boy who laughs easily and trusts freely because he's never known a world where the adults in his life don't have his best interests at heart. Sometimes they visit me for dinner, and we sit on my small balcony, eating simple food while watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And in those moments, looking at their faces and knowing that they're safe, that they have futures full of possibility instead of fear, I understand what real wealth looks like. It's not about what you have, it's about what you're willing to give up for the people who matter. It's about using whatever power you possess, not to elevate yourself, but to lift up those who can't lift themselves. It's about understanding that at the end of your life, the only currency that matters is the love you've given and the lives you've touched. If you're watching this and you have privilege, if you have resources, if you have power that others don't, let me ask you something. What are you doing with it? Are you using it to build walls around yourself, to protect your comfort and security? Or are you using it to tear down the systems that keep others trapped in darkness? Because I learned something in that alley 3 years ago, something that changed everything. We are not gods, no matter how much wealth we accumulate or how many people worship our success. We are human beings, connected to each other by bonds stronger than money, responsible for each other in ways that go deeper than profit margins or social status. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, someone comes into our lives with eyes like the deep sea and a heart full of love. And they show us what we're really capable of when we stop being afraid of losing everything and start being afraid of never truly living at all. The girl who refused my money taught me that kindness without action is just sentiment, that privilege without purpose is just waste, that wealth without heart is indeed just paper. She taught me that real courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and choosing love anyway. And if that's not worth everything I gave up to learn it, then I don't know what is. That's my story. The story of how a spoiled rich boy met a homeless girl and discovered that sometimes the people who have nothing are the ones who have everything that matters. How I learned that being born into privilege isn't a blessing unless you use it to bless others. How I found out that the eyes of truth, blue as ancient seas and deep as forever, can change a man's entire world if he's brave enough to really see what they're showing him. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And if this story has touched you in any way, please remember that there are Melanians everywhere. Children whose only crime is being born into circumstances beyond their control. They're waiting for someone with power to notice them, to care about them, to fight for them. They're waiting for someone like you.
Peace in places I don't show, no need for words. Your eyes already know the kind of love that never lets you go. And though the world may change and seasons move, this heart will beat with only one truth. I'm falling into you, like stars into the sky, like ocean waves that know just where to lie. No reason fights the truth, no fear can break it through. 'Cause I was made for love, and I'm falling into you. So let me fall, and don't hold back the tide. Some loves are meant to rise, not just to hide. And if I'm wrong, then let me be untrue. 'Cause even in the fall, I'm falling into you. Some hearts move slow, like rivers through the night, but mine found you, and everything felt right. I tried to wait, I tried to stay away, but love like this, it doesn't ask, it stays. And every time you breathe, I hear a song, a quiet pool that's been here all along. I'm falling into you, like stars into the sky, like ocean waves that know just where to lie. No reason fights the truth, no fear can break it through. 'Cause I was made for love, and I'm falling into you.